Funding for
Good Thing, Bad Thing
is provided by the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying health care, and Lockheed, a bold new force in systems engineering. Manage major funding for
Good Thing, Bad Thing
is provided by the financial support of viewers like you.
Do I start now? When do I go? Wait a little bit. All right. There I am. Ready? All right. Wa Shang Hao. That's Chinese, as best as I can pronounce it, for good evening. Before we commence tonight's lecture, I'd like to address several points of criticism lodged against my previous lectures on the French and Russian revolutions, respectively. F*** you. I don't have time for your bullshit. So I exaggerated when I said Yuri Gagarin climbed out of his space capsule. Who cares? I know full well, of course, he had an ejector seat. I'm not an ignoramus. But of course, I don't expect snot-nosed Weisenheimers such as yourselves to comprehend the intricacies of poetic license. You may want to open up a dictionary one of these days and look up a little word called showmanship. Also, some viewers have complained that my voice gives them headaches and causes others nausea. Well, go listen to something else then. What am I, some sort of pantyhose songbird you can wheel out for your careless amusement?
These motherfuckers, I swear, they tried to kill! Yo, fight this! Yo, fight this!
I gotta say, I'm beginning to feel real
intensely
underappreciated right about now. What? What's that look supposed to mean? What do you mean I can't curse on public television? I pay for it, I can say whatever the hell I want on it. It's not like anybody actually watches this garbage anyway. Oh,
fiddlesticks.
Our sponsors. I forgot about them. God damn it. Look, let's try this from the top, shall we? Wa Shang Hao, good evening, etc., etc. The Chinese Revolution. Good thing, bad thing, Episode 1. Sun turns, moon turns, sun turns, moon. And so we begin at the beginning. This is China, and this is China, and this is also China. It is a land of contrasts, a land of breathtaking, almost otherworldly beauty, and it is a land of appalling, revolting hideousness. It is a colossal land, stretching from the azure waters of the Pacific Ocean to the towering peaks of the Himalayan mountains, from the lonely sands of the Gobi Desert to the sweltering forests of the Red River. And for almost 10,000 years, the people who have called this land their home are no less a people of contrasts, of contradictions, of riddles, wrapped in mysteries, wrapped in riddles. These are Chinese people. They are simultaneously one people and many peoples, bathed in an elaborate history that reaches back about as far as human memory will permit. They are the inheritors of perhaps the oldest, most venerable culture mankind has ever produced. A culture that gave to the world the compass, the crossbow, the umbrella, gunpowder, paper, porcelain, egg rolls, wontons, MSG-related illnesses, but somehow never managed to invent knives, forks, or spoons.
Spoon! Anyway, how is your sex life?
At times, the Chinese have been unified into one of several great dynastic empires, whose artistic and technological achievements rank among the finest of human endeavor. And at other times, they've gone bing, bang, bong, pow, ping, ow, slaughtering one another wholesale in a bloody pattern of dynasty, civil war, dynasty, civil war. Like the majestic motions of distant celestial bodies, China is always changing. But also like the distant celestial... China always stays the same. Night gives way to day, day gives way to night. The wild goose prances in the apricot blossoms. The slumberous tiger yawns in the shadow of the plum tree. And so on, you get the point. The other thing you'll probably already know about the Chinese is that there are a whole
multitude
load of them. 1.3 billion to be exact, of which I could name maybe 3. Xi Jinping, Yao Ming, and Liu Kang. That's way too many Chinese if you ask me. As a civilizational stratagem, the Chinese opted for the swarm approach, which works fairly well in the early to mid-game, but proves unsustainable once the other factions start tech leveling. My father used to say that Chinese women laid eggs like hens, and I believed him for upwards of 40 years until a regrettable incident occurred between myself and a Chinese colleague. Still, I remain steadfast in my belief that the Chinese are genetic superiors. Like the clever mouse, their morphology allows them to contort their bodies into the most cramped of tiny spaces, such as your typical Chinese apartment building. Your average
man from China
can also subsist on half the food of a lesser man and still cogitate at an extremely high level. It is for these reasons that I fully anticipate to one day welcome our Chinese overlords, to whom I offer my services as a humble historian. Just don't castrate me like that one guy. What's his name? Sima Qian. Yeah, him. Look, you just keep that shit away from me. Not that the wife is all that keen these days anyway. Yeah, you heard what I said. But seriously, of all the big, dumb revolutions of the past century or two, the Chinese Revolution was by far the most, Chinese. On the one hand, you could say it was the most successful, in the sense that the People's Republic of China has effectively filled the void of the Soviet Union as the world's biggest boogeyman. On the other hand, you could say it was the least successful, in the sense that the Chinese have all but abandoned communism for a far more traditional authoritarian system, one that bears more than a passing resemblance to the everlasting bureaucracies of the former imperial Chinese states. It may also have been the bloodiest, most miserable revolution to date, with none of the romantic optimism of the French, nor the intellectual bravura of the Russian. Marxists these days seem almost embarrassed by it, and seldom if ever rise to its defense, unlike the familiar litanies of simping apologia regularly recited on behalf of all those Bolshevik
practitioners of sexual deviancy.
Like everything else made in China, the Chinese Revolution is an inferior copy, a poor imitation of far more interesting social upheavals, but I have a lecture series to finish, goddammit, and I don't care how long it takes or how many lives I destroy in the process. I'm going to tell these stories of human folly, error, and hubris because I must, because the public needs to be informed, and because left to your own devices, you youngsters simply can't be bothered to do the reading. You may not like this any more than I do, but we're going to get through it together. Let me take you on a journey of discovery into the contrasts and the cycles and the grand drama of
China, 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 China.
Oh God, what have I gotten myself into? Episode 2. Curious beetle prod hasty grasshopper, prudent mouse bide his time. This is China. The really real this time, China. So some sights. There's the Yangtze River, I believe. Not sure what that is. Shanghai, largest city. Peking, of course. Who's this giant fat guy supposed to be? Oh wait, never mind. Some farms, I guess. Aw, isn't that nice? They're smiling. Although, to be perfectly frank, I sometimes wonder if China even exists. That it isn't a fictitious entity like Santa Claus or Helen Keller, cooked up by economists and political commentators to justify their phony baloney jobs at various think tanks that refuse to hire me. What do these people have that I don't have, I'd like to know? And why do they all look related? I mean, did George Will wander the country like Johnny Appleseed, sowing scions at every rustic one-stoplight town? Have the gates to Erebus finally opened and the armies of Hades poured out from their numberless Thonian mansions? Oh, so sorry I barged into your little club. No, I'm leaving. You'll get no more trouble from me. I don't even want to join your club, not even if you got down on your knees and begged me. Although, could I join? I'll be good, I promise. I won't curse or make any insensitive remarks. Tom, it's me, your old pal, James. Do you think you could put in a good word for me, Tom? Just a little word with a few of the guys. All right, I'm sure I'll hear from you. I just thought I'd throw that out there. You take care now. Anyway, according to one of these experts, deceased American sinologist Lucian Pye, China is a civilization masquerading as a country. Now, just what the hell does that mean? Well, I think it's an attempt to illustrate just how enormous the concept of China actually is. Truly, it is a continent's worth of peoples, kingdoms, empires, wars, myths, legends, and lore, all packed into one. As a geopolitical entity, China is what Europe would have been had the Roman Empire never collapsed into ignominy, but had instead simply suffered through several changes in management. Speaking of the Romans, there are, strangely enough, many points of similarity. Like the Romans, the Chinese always put the family name first, and so one finds a proliferation of several common Chinese names, including, but not limited to, Li Han, Han Li, Li Han Han Li, Yu Wang, Yu Hu, Hu Ha, Long Dong, Huge Wang, and Tiny Peeny. To continue, the modern Chinese language, now called Standard Chinese, is descended from Mandarin, which was, like Latin in the West, the lingua franca of scholars and officials for well over 1,000 years, despite the fact that a single misplaced vowel sound, or tone, can mean the difference between I would like another cupcake
我是中文学生
and please come over here and sit on my face.
谢谢不用谢
These are historical facts. Now how about all this balderdash? What are all these strokes and squiggles supposed to mean? Oh, there's 50,000 of them, are there? And each character represents a different object or concept, do they? Well, what do you want from me? Do you want me to coo and awe over the ornate calligraphy like some Upper East Side pansy? 'Cause I won't. Looks like a piece of fly paper to me. It goes without saying the Chinese writing system is pictorial in origin. It evolved over thousands of years from crude etchings on the bones of dead animals, gee, I wonder what this is supposed to represent, to the elaborate and mystifying gibberish we see today. Look, China, you don't get a prize for making things harder than they need to be. You do this all the time, whether it be language, writing, mathematics, even dining. You don't have to turn everything into some kind of goddamn art form. You're just showing off, aren't you? Pathetic. And that's another thing. The Chinese get way too much credit for being innovative. So they came up with gunpowder. Whoop-de-doo. They had that for like 500 years, and in all that time, nobody ever thought about putting some into a little metal tube with a little metal ball and making it go. Oh, wait a minute, I guess they did. But the point stands. The Chinese invent both gunpowder and guns and then confidently assume everyone else is too stupid to replicate or more accurately improve upon their genius. Or how about this thing? Something called a pig toilet.
It's disgusting. I don't want to talk about it.
How did it work? Well, there's this little wooden seat, and inside this seat is a little round hole, and beneath this hole is a pigsty, generally containing pigs. The pigs eat from the owners until they are slaughtered and themselves consumed, feeding yet more pigs in what some moderns surely think is an elegant and sustainable cycle.
Honestly, it was disgusting.
Meanwhile, around the same time, who else but the Romans had figured out a little thing called running water. Not that it's all that likely, but if I were to comedically slip and fall into a time machine at any point, I know in which set of space-time coordinates I'd much prefer to evacuate my bowel. Moving on. Religion. There are lots of them. There's this one, and this one too. In China, throughout the ages, the two most prominent religions were Buddhism, imported from India in the 2nd century, and Taoism, a homegrown philosophy that got haphazardly mixed up with a whole bunch of traditional codswallop. You know, it always yanks my chain whenever people complain about Christianity as if it was solely responsible for the ongoing ignorance of mankind. Do you people have any idea just how
cognitively impaired
most religions are? Tell me if this makes any sense at all. There was once this guy called the Jade Emperor, who was born in the kingdom of pure felicity and majestic heavenly lights, wherever that is, and was originally the assistant of the Jade Pure One, or the Celestial Venerable of the Primordial Beginning, who was himself one of the 3 Pure Ones, or the 3 Pristine Clarities, the rulers of the 3 heavens who may or may not have been born out of the Hundun, otherwise known as the Heavenly King of the chaotic, never-ending Primordial Beginning. Everybody with me so far? Good, because this gets complicated. It is said the Heavenly King of the chaotic, never-ending Primordial Beginning was itself a manifestation of the Great Tao, which produced the Jade Pure One, previously mentioned, which produced the Supreme Pure One, or the Lord of Numinous Treasure, who, as the custodian of Yin and Yang, next produced the Grand Pure One, or the Lord of the Way and Virtue, at least until the Jade Emperor. Wait a minute, that's not the Jade Emperor, that's Kendra Jade. Who I definitely don't know who she is, attained immortality by passing the 3,200 trials, each lasting 3 million years, and thereby banishing the 4 great dragons. Now, the 4 great dragons were each buried beneath a different mountain from which sprang the 4 great rivers, yellow, black, red, and white, which incidentally represent the 4 cardinal directions, after which the Jade Emperor was retroactively promoted to creator and emperor of all things, including the 3 pure ones, chose the 12 sacred animals of the zodiac, and appointed his eventual successor, who will one day rule as the heavenly master of the dawn of Jade of the Golden Door.
Don't make fun of the Chinese people. Make fun, not funny.
Basically, the whole of Chinese cosmology is a Fast and Furious movie.
Hey, brother.
Episode 3. Heavenly waters flowing down mighty mountain feed rising people. Our story begins here. No, more like over there. Keep going. Keep going. A little further. Come on, I don't have all day. Wait, stop. Stop, you moron. There. This is the Yellow River, or the Huanghe. It is one of the world's great rivers, along with the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, and the Yangtze, also in China, one of the so-called cradles of civilization. In its long, meandering journey across the northwestern plateau, the Yellow River steadily gathers millions of tons of nutrient-rich silt, called loess, which aside from giving the river its muddy complexion, also transforms the nearby plains into some of the most fertile farmland in all the world. But there is a problem. Unlike the Nile, which seasonally floods in a predictable manner, the Yellow River is a wild river. Its floods can come any time during the year, or sometimes not at all, and like a female motorist, it has a bad habit of suddenly and drastically altering course. It's like when Gladys decides she's going to visit her sister and just runs off without telling me anything. How am I supposed to eat? Who will lay out my clothes? Who's going to turn on the TV? There's so many buttons and doodads on the remote these days, and there's like 5 different goddamn remotes. It's balderdash. Anyway, the Yellow River's acutely feminine disposition proved a major hurdle for the ancient Chinese. To tame the wild waters, a man called Liu the Great supposedly devised the intricate system of irrigation that made Chinese civilization possible. Now, Liu the Great was the descendant of the mythical Huangdi, or Yellow Emperor, one of the highest deities of the 5 regions, or alternatively, one of the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors who in time immemorial vanquished the felonious Flame Emperor, and some other guy who had 4 eyes and 6 arms, thus laying the foundation for the Chinese state. These are historical facts. Thenceforward, according to the grand historian Sima Qian, the dynastic cycle officially began. And we will go through them now, one by one, whether you like it or not, so pay attention. The Zheng Dynasty. Probably didn't exist. Moving on. The Shang Dynasty.
Mr. I'll make a man out of you.
Famous for oracle bones, bronze cookware, and probably some other things. The Zhao Dynasty. Founded when King Wu of Zhao overthrew King Zhao of Shang, which is a little confusing. To justify their conquest, the Zhao clan introduced the concept of the Mandate of Heaven, in which the gods demonstrate their approval or disapproval of the current ruler by sending droughts, plagues, madness, disease, etc., etc.
You know you make me wanna
kick my heels up and throw my hands up and throw my hands back. Come on now. All right, enough. The Spring and Autumn period. The Zhao dynasty slowly disintegrates into several feudal princedoms, during which time the so-called 100 schools of thought flourished. The general Sun Tzu writes his seminal text, The Art of War, which, if you know anything at all about the Chinese, recommends a very sneaky kind of war. On the other hand, you had the philosopher Lao Tzu, who was born as a 70-year-old man and a little later promotes his big idea, the wise ruler is he who does as little as possible. Brother, you said it, my God. And of course, there was Confucius.
Confucius say, girl who bathes with vinegar walk around with sour puss.
Now this guy was a laugh-a-minute. Probably the most famous and hilarious of all the ancient Chinese comedians, who among other things formulated an early version of the Golden Rule. Never impose on others what you would not choose for yourself.
Confucius also say, boy who goes to bed with sex problem on mind wakes up with solution on hand.
I gotta say, all things considered, this was a pretty good time to be a
Man from China.
What do you mean I can't say It's a man from China. A China man. Nobody minds when you say Englishmen or Frenchmen or Dutchmen or homosexual. What, I can't say that either? Oh, for Christ's sake, this. The Warring States period. But naturally, everything had to go haywire. For the next 200 years or so, the Chinese go at each other's throats, as each kingdom attempts to seize the coveted mandate of heaven from the sinking Zhou Dynasty. They foolishly beat the hell out of each other for about 150 years, until the state of Qin, formerly the poorest and most backward Chinese kingdom, steamrolls everybody in a series of ghastly and horrific wars. The Qin Dynasty. Although it only lasted for 20 to 30 years, the Qin Dynasty might very well be the most pivotal. After conquering his rivals, the king of Qin declared himself to be the Qin Shi Huangdi, or the very first ascertainable Chinese emperor. He is probably one of the most important people in all of history. Those terracotta warriors you may have heard about, well, those were his, as was the city-sized mausoleum he had built for himself, which archaeologists are still excavating to this very day. As you can probably guess, he was also a
incorrigible reprobate
who ordered hundreds of thousands of men to their deaths building the Great Wall, and executed anybody who dared to look him in the face or even mention his name. He spent his later years searching for an elixir of life and eventually acquired the ability to live forever. Until he died. Nevertheless, the legacy of the Qin Dynasty endures. It is, in a sense, responsible for the very idea of China. Although subsequent rulers would rise and fall, each of them would attempt to rebuild the politically unified, culturally homogenized Empire of Qin, what in Chinese they call the Qinghua, or as we say in English, China. You see how I did that there? Now that's good writing. The Han Dynasty.
I got a bad feeling about this.
Another seminal dynasty was the Han Dynasty, and one of the few dynasties with a compelling origin story. Back during the Qin days, a local commander and sex god named Liu Bang lost track of some prisoners he was escorting to their execution. Now, under Qin law, the penalty for allowing prisoners to escape was also execution, so instead of turning himself in, Liu Bang said, "F it," and joined the escapees in their rebellion. I mean, what would you do? Turns out, this Liu Bang guy was a military and political genius of the highest order. He and his merry band of outlaws gathered support from the peasantry, joined up with several other rebellions, and eventually overthrew the despised Qin Dynasty, probably in some great big battle. Liu Bang was then enthroned as Emperor Gaozu. The peasants went over the moon with joy, and later that night, several lucky ladies were treated to a mandate with heaven. Liu Bang and his successors did such a good job that to this day most Chinese refer to their ethnicity as Han Chinese. So there you go. The Three Kingdoms. But the good times didn't last, and the Han Dynasty eventually crumbles. This time into three big chunks. The Northern Kingdom of Wei, the Western Kingdom of Shu, and the Eastern Kingdom of Wu. A brilliant military and political leader known as Chaozhou, the Bill Clinton of classical China, attempts to subdue the two southern kingdoms, but is defeated at the legendary Battle of the Red Cliffs, later the subject matter for a rather shitty Chinese film.
I'm going to say this again. I did not
attempt to conquer China.
Indeed I did.
Attempt to conquer China.
I did not. Indeed I did.
And then he apologized like a little baby.
The Qin Dynasty, the 16 Kingdoms, the Northern and Southern Dynasties, more civil wars, great sorrow, lots of death, lucky numbers 3, 17, 82, 45. The Sui Dynasty.
Come on, pig!
Finally, China pulls herself back together. Although short-lived, the Sui emperors accomplished a number of good things. They constructed the Grand Canal, repaired the Great Wall, and also attempted to conquer Korea until they got their asses handed to them. Still, they laid the groundwork for the Tang Dynasty. perhaps the high watermark of Chinese civilization. Under the Tang Dynasty, China's territory greatly expanded, the perennial barbarian menace was pushed back or bribed off, invention and poetry flourished, and they even found the time to trot out a novel experiment in emperorship. A woman. Yes, there was one, and only one, Empress of China. Her name was Zetian, and like all great women in history, she began her life as a prostitute.
One who performs sexual acts in exchange for money.
No, I don't know why that is. It just seems to be the case. In a long and fascinating tale of palace intrigue that would make for a splendid HBO miniseries in case anyone over there is watching this, Zetian rose from lowly concubine to royal consort to empress dowager and finally to empress regnant. And woe to anyone who underestimated her. This bitch took no prisoners. She had no qualms whatsoever about murdering or exiling her own children, and would sleep with any man or woman who could advance her quest for absolute power.
Me so horny.
In all the annals of Chinese history, and there are lots of those, no female has shown such guile, such cunning, such cruel and remorseless focus than the formidable Zetian, with the possible exception of Mrs. Wong, who does my dry cleaning. Frankly, she terrifies me. The 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms, self-explanatory. The Song Dynasty. The Song Dynasty was notable for being the first dynasty to relocate to southern China. Had a pretty good run there until they were utterly flattened by the Mongols. The Yuan Dynasty. These would be the Mongols. Basically the medieval Asian equivalent of lunatic American rednecks. Famous for moving the capital back north to Peking, where it has been ever since. Also attempted to invade Japan, but were thwarted when a sudden typhoon, or kamikaze, sank all their ships. More on them later. The Ming Dynasty. Famous for making priceless vases that tend to shatter in any number of highly amusing ways. Also famous for the explorations of Zheng, a Muslim eunuch who sailed the high seas in these enormous treasure ship things. Zheng made it all the way around India to East Africa and was this goddamn close from discovering the New World. But instead, in what may be the stupidest act of government ever, the Hongji Emperor forbade any further exploration and burned all of Zheng's ships. From thenceforth, the Chinese embarked on a policy of closing themselves off from the outside world. The Qin Dynasty. Didn't we already have one of those? The Qing Dynasty. This is the last of the great Chinese dynasties, and it is this dynasty that shall now concern us.
Me so horny. You keep lying. Me love you long time.
Episode 4 will be skipped because it's unlucky. Episode 5. Spring blossoms falling on summer's sword, noble falcon chase daring dragonfly. This is the Forbidden City of Peking. Built during the Ming Dynasty in the early 15th century, it became the residence of the imperial court for the remainder of the dynastic period. It was the scene of many...
Mr. O'Flannery?
What? Who said that?
I did, sir.
What's going on?
Mr. O'Flannery, I just actually had a question about the dynasties. If you don't mind?
If I don't mind. Let me understand this. You're interrupting me during a lecture.
Yeah, but I just had a question. For the Han Dynasty, I heard there was an Eastern Han and a Western Han. Is that true?
Billy, Dean's office now.
Oh, come on, I was just asking a question.
Dean's office now.
But I didn't do anything.
Dean's office now.
Oh, god damn it. Frickin' asshole.
I heard that. Don't think that just because this is previously recorded that I can't also hear you. Let me assure you, I can. Now, wonderful. I've lost my place. Okay, let's see here. Did the Yellow River, the Dynasties, Forbidden City, right. This is the Forbidden City, the palace of the Qing emperors. Now the Qing were composed of the Manchu people, who were a bit like the Puerto Ricans of China. They loved their big flags and their cookouts, street fights and loud noises. And if you asked most Han Chinese, they'd probably say the Manchus weren't even Chinese at all. It certainly didn't help matters any that the Qing forced every man in China to get the same goddamn haircut, those long ponytail things. Chinese barbers suffered greatly. But in other respects, the Qing took on board most of the customs, standards, and practices of their predecessors. The same was also true of the Mongols, as every outside conqueror realized the only way to govern their enormous, sprawling empires was through the seemingly eternal Chinese bureaucracy. As an aside, the Chinese civil service is one of the most durable and admirable features of Chinese civilization. From at least the Han Dynasty, the Chinese deployed several meritocratic systems for choosing and promoting city officials, record keepers, civil engineers, and so on. These systems eventually coalesced into the Imperial Examination, or Keiju, an extremely difficult test meant to identify and recommend the very best scholar officials, also known as Mandarins. The system worked so well that it remained in place, relatively unchanged, for over 1,000 years, the quintessential example of Chinese excellence. So the Chinese are good at test-taking, are they? Well. Anyway, those are my thoughts on that. So how about this Forbidden City thing? Apparently, it's the most expensive piece of real estate in all the world, valued at well over $70 billion. What a shame if it were to suddenly burn down. Just kidding. The Forbidden City is indeed one of the great wonders of the world, although it can be regarded as a symbol of Chinese tyranny, both past and present. I'd much prefer to marvel at its sublime craftsmanship and stately magnificence. Inside this lavish and opulent complex of halls, gardens, and pavilions lived of yore the Chinese emperors and their womenfolk, but no one else. As with the taboo of mentioning the emperor by name, no men, including the emperor's own sons, were permitted to dwell within the Forbidden City after nightfall, the only exception being the small army of eunuchs who attended the emperor's every need. Now, if you don't know what a eunuch is, go ask your parents. Wait a minute, don't do that. You're going to get me into trouble. Okay, look. The practice of castration is as old, awful, and ubiquitous as several other delightful human practices, such as slavery, torture, or infanticide, all of which the Chinese also practiced. However, few civilizations took castration quite so far as the Chinese, who not only removed the testes, but also the penis, in a process called emasculation. One might think males of all ages would be eager to avoid such a fate, but actually instances of self-castration were rather common. The pay was pretty good, I guess. I mean, this litter ain't gonna bear itself. Come on, fellas, look snappy. Chop, chop. And while we're on the topic of barbaric, inhumane practices, how about we take a look at foot binding? The whole thing got started when one emperor, Emperor Liu of the Tang Dynasty, demanded his concubines dance on the points of their toes for his sick pleasure. Things got out of hand from there. Girls as young as 4 years old would have the bones of their feet broken, the toes curled inward, and the pathetic bleeding stumps bound in tight wrappings. From thenceforth until the end of her days, the girl could only hobble around on bovine little hooves fitted into silk slippers. Physical labor was out of the question, as was any kind of running, jumping, or dancing, even if only for her own happiness. Foot binding, along with not trimming your nails, eventually turned into a weird kind of status symbol. At its height, as many as half of all Chinese women had bound feet, and all because one goddamn emperor had a goddamn foot fetish. That's one thing I'll never understand. What the hell is the matter with you people? Feet are the part of the body furthest from the face for a reason. They are bastions of bacteria, fungi, and all manner of offending odors. Look, I get you're consenting adults and everything, but I don't have to applaud what you hobgoblins get up to in your free time. You should be ashamed of yourselves.
Hey, is he gonna puke? Is he gonna puke right now?
Now, I don't want to pick on the Chinese too much. Tight-laced corsets were just as weird and debilitating, if also far less common. But can you guess who put a stop to all this deranged nonsense? I'll tell you. American and British women. Yes, believe it or not, Western feminists were once greatly concerned about the welfare of women and girls beyond their shores. Those fuddy-duddy fillies had some wacky ideas, I tell you. Among other things, they insisted that men behave themselves, that women be educated, and that children should not be had outside of marriage. Goodness, what lunacy. Surprisingly, they were considerably less concerned about women endlessly exploring their sexuality, or opting for cosmopolitan spinsterhood as an alternative to, say, having a family and a home. I mean, since when have any women anywhere ever desired such things? And if they had, it must have been the patriarchy that put it into their heads. It's all the patriarchy, everything. It's just men. Everything's our fault, isn't it? I suppose you ladies are going to get your asses over to Somalia now and maybe put a stop to the wicked and reprehensible practice of female circumcision. No? You're just going to keep going on about all these different genders, are you? All right then, whatever you say. No, I'm listening, please. Keep talking. Episode 6. Clever fox steal hen from hen house. Lazy oxen look the other way. This is the Great Wall of China.
A big, beautiful, powerful, big, powerful, beautiful, big wall. It can have a gate, it can have a door.
Like all walls, it is a division between places. A line that marks out the contrasts between the supreme and harmonious realm of China and the barbarous and wretched realms of every place else. First constructed during the Qin Dynasty, but periodically improved and strengthened by subsequent dynasties, this elaborate series of walls and fortifications stretches for thousands of miles across northern China. It was originally intended to keep out the fearsome horsemen of Central Asia who love nothing better than to storm into China and steal all her
belongings.
We're under attack! Light the signal!
Wait a minute, don't play that part yet. First, let's back up a bit. Central Asia, otherwise known as the world's perineum. More specifically, this is the Great Steppe, a vast sea of sparse grassland flowing endlessly across the Eurasian continent. It was here, long ago, that a great but nameless man stared at one of these things and said to himself, "You know, I bet if I jump on its back, it'll let me ride it around." And like a lot of things, everyone thought he was crazy until one day, he wasn't. Genius works like that. Anyway, the first horsemen to make an appearance in history were the charioteers. Like a bad rash spreading from the perineum, these ancient equivalents of rowdy biker gangs struck out in every direction. Some headed westwards and through a series of bloody encounters, gradually transferred this new technology past the Caspian and Black Seas into Anatolia and thence to Bronze Age Assyria, Egypt, and Greece. Others, however, struck out eastward and before too long ran smack dab into the Zheng Dynasty, sometime around 1250 BC. This marks the beginning of China's long and turbulent relationship with those ferocious nomads beyond her borders. Like the Assyrians and the Egyptians, the Chinese readily adopted the chariot into their militaries. However, the steppe peoples always managed to stay one step ahead. The subsequent
kleptocracy, the guys who are the kleptocracy.
I know words, I have the best words.
The subsequent inventions of the saddle and the stirrup, also originating in Central Asia, allowed the riding of horses from what's known as the forward or control position. This enabled horse and rider to charge, wheel, feint, and do all those other things you see in the movies. Suddenly, chariots were very old hat. Just about every civilization with expectations of survival were trading them in for cavalry as fast as they could, and if they couldn't get any cavalry, then, well, they'd better start building walls. Now, the Chinese did have cavalry, just not particularly good cavalry. Actually, probably really shitty cavalry. But what they could do, though, and this perhaps better than any people before or since, is build walls. They walled their houses, they walled their farms, they walled their towns, they walled their cities, and it wasn't too great a leap in logic for someone to suggest, hey, why don't we just wall off the whole goddamn place? Which is what they did. The first sections of what would come to be called the Great Wall were built under the edicts of Qin Huangdi sometime around 200 BC. As I have already mentioned, he was not exactly a great guy to work for. Some Chinese legends say his men were worked to the point of exhaustion, at which time they collapsed and were entombed alive within the spine of the wall, where their bones remain to this very day. Ooh, creepy. But who was this wall supposed to stop precisely? Well, it's a bit of a rogues gallery. First you had the Xiongnu people, a faction of whom may also have split off to become the Huns.
Now all of China knows you're here.
I'm afraid of gay people. I have this nightmare that I go to Hollywood and find out that Mr. T is a
Then you had the Rouran people, then the Turkic people, then the Turkic people again, and finally and most famously, the Mongols, none of which made a scrap of difference to the Chinese, who referred to all these people as Yi, or barbarians.
Get out of here, f***ing Mongolian! Don't you break down my wall!
Of course, little of the original Great Wall remains today. The Great Wall that we all know and recognize was largely constructed during the Ming Dynasty in the 14th century. A popular rumor has it that the Great Wall is the only man-made structure that can be seen from outer space. But here, look at this photograph. I can't see anything, can you? Magnify. 10 times. No, Stu, nothing. Frankly, I think this is just another instance of the Chinese grabbing their dick.
Johnson's.
Also, China, seriously, I don't see how this is supposed to work. You do know there are these things called boats, right? They could just go right around there when you're not looking. Here, I'll fix it for you. There, all finished. I mean, when you do something this crazy, you might as well go all the way with it. Now, while the Great Wall may never have been as effective or large as the Chinese would have you believe, it nonetheless reveals a unique insight into the Chinese character. To the traditional Chinese mind, China is the Middle Kingdom, occupying a place between the Upper Kingdom, or the heavens, and the Lower Kingdoms, which are all the rest of us grubby lowlifes. At times, during their immensely convoluted history, especially during the Han, Tang, and Ming dynasties, the Chinese have been fairly open to the world, dispatching explorers and emissaries such as the plucky Zhang Qian to neighboring India and Persia. But at other times the Chinese have been notoriously cloistered, shrouding themselves in the pleasing and slightly salty aroma of their own flatulence. They seem to believe they could sit back forever behind their walls, their oceans, and their western deserts, untroubled by the affairs of lesser peoples, serenely convinced of their cultural and technological superiority, because obviously, what civilization could equal the majesty and splendor of the peerless Middle Kingdom? But that's not to say that some things didn't spread from China. What sort of things? Well, you remember how much fun we've been having lately. I wonder if anything like that has ever happened before. Look, China, it's called sanitation. Why don't you try it sometime? No more in garbage cans. Stop it. And what's that hanging upside down? I hope that's been thoroughly washed. Wait a minute. Just what the hell are you even eating? What animal is that? Pangolin? How did it get way up there? I thought they were all at the South Pole or something. What are those things? Aren't those pangolins? Oh, pangolins. All right, whatever. Big difference. Now, besides devastating diseases, China also exported good things like silk. Made from the fine fibrous excretions of the diligent silkworm, probably from the anus if I had to guess, silk fabric was an instant hit. Everybody loved it, and only the Chinese could make it. Yet another instance of the fabulous prowess of the Yellow Emperor. Demand for silk was so great that an entire trading network, the eponymous Silk Road, developed to move silk westward in a series of hops. The Romans got hooked on the stuff pretty early on and passed their addiction on to their crack baby children. But it wasn't until the high Middle Ages when a handful of daring Western adventurers braved the long journey the other way. The two most famous of these are the legendary traveler Ibn Battuta and, of course, Marco. Aw, you got me. In the late 13th century, Marco Polo, only 17 years old, embarked on an extraordinary adventure throughout the Orient. Marco and his uncle and father crossed the Silk Road, mostly on foot, and eventually reached the court of the recently enthroned Yuan Emperor. This would have been that storied figure, Kublai Khan, who took such a liking to young Marco he wouldn't let him leave. He kept making up excuses like, "Oh, my daughter's coming by and she really wants to meet you," or, "Hey, why don't you stay for dinner? We're getting takeout. I know this terrific place." "God Dragon, what's your order?" In the end, Marco Polo spent 24 years in China, having served Kublai Khan variously as an emissary and trusted courier, eventually racking up well over 1 million billion steps. That's over 15,000 miles for us normal people who prefer automobile transportation. Hey, learn how to drive. After Marco returned home to Venice, he was captured in one of those little impudent wars between Venice and Genoa. Imprisoned by the Genoese, he met, in his jail cell, the romantic writer something Italian, da Pisa, to whom he relayed his incredible story. De Pisa took his accounts and turned them into The Travels of Marco Polo, one of the first bestsellers in the Western canon. Also, legend has it that Marco Polo introduced spaghetti to Italian cuisine, although most Italians will fight you to the death on that.
Is it true that the Chinese invented spaghetti?
Now think about it. Why would people who eat with sticks invent something that you need a fork to eat?
Episode 7. No, wait a minute, we're still on episode 6. Sorry, I must be losing it.
All men and women created by you know the thing. You know how we talk about it.
So China has a great wall and she has her Silk Road, and life is simply peaches and cream. Nothing could ever upend this impeccable state of affairs. Nope, nothing in the whole wide world. This is Spain, in case any of you retards
Special needs children
couldn't tell. And I'm sure at least some of you know, or at least I hope some of you know, that the Spaniards and the Portuguese went on a bit of a tear from about 1492 onwards. It all got started when the Ottomans sacked Constantinople, choking off European access to the Silk Road. They did this mainly to screw over the Christians, but they ended up screwing over themselves since the Christian kingdoms happened to have a secret weapon up their sleeves, the sailing ship. Now, it wasn't much, mind you, and I've repeatedly argued that the men who willingly got into these rickety, leaky death traps had the largest and hardest tackles of any men who ever walked the face of the earth. Yes, even harder than that. By the end of the 15th century, Spain and Portugal are shooting their loads of explorers just about all over the place, almost all of them looking for a sea route to China. Christopher Columbus stumbles across the New World and all that, but what he was really after was China, and all the goodies Europeans couldn't produce for themselves. Silk, porcelain, tea, spices. Which spices? I don't know. No one ever specifies. Just spices. Before long, these Christian maniacs make contact with the Chinese and establish a handful of trading posts on islands at the mouths of rivers, since the Qing government refused to allow any foreigners onto their territory. These would be places like Macau and what would come to be Hong Kong. The English, French, and Dutch arrive a little bit later. Now, to say the Chinese were a little touchy about all this is an understatement. Among other things, they made it a crime for anyone to teach their language to a foreigner, and adopted the posture that these bold, bearded strangers, who had traveled halfway around the world to reach them, were quite naturally their inferiors. It's a little as if space aliens landed in the middle of Central Park, and the first thing the mayor does is impound their spaceship and prosecute them for tax evasion. But perhaps we should be more understanding. For most of human history, the Chinese had been at the cutting edge of mathematics, science, engineering, architecture, economics, and medicine. Or at least, so they thought. It never occurred to anyone in the Middle Kingdom that one or more of those barbarian peoples beyond their borders might one day leap ahead of them in these respects, and it was quite a shock when this proved to be the case. A story goes that when the first British diplomat made contact with the then-reigning Qianlong Emperor, he angered the emperor by refusing to kowtow. He kneeled in the European fashion, presented the emperor with the clock and some other things, and pleaded with him to recognize the great wisdom in trading with Great Britain, to which the emperor had this to say.
Our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no products within its borders. There is therefore no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce.
Well, f*** you too. If you ask me, the Chinese deserved what they got. The British flattened the Chinese in 2 wars called the Opium Wars, during which they seized Hong Kong and forced the Chinese to import millions of tons of soothing, relaxing opium. The French and the Japanese got in on the action a little later. The Chinese themselves have a term for this period. They call it the Century of Humiliation. and you better believe they're still sore about it. But if you think for one goddamn second the Chinese wouldn't have done the exact same thing or worse if the binding had been on the other foot, then you need to go back and do the reading. Better still, go to any small country town, find the local Denny's and ask yourself, where are all these drugs coming from? Episode 7. Ill-tempered donkey kick wall of house, bang boom, everything fall down. This is the Bund of Shanghai, once the largest and most important of the several foreign quarters conceded by the Qin Dynasty during the Century of Humiliation. Western merchants and dignitaries set up shop here, and even worse, as far as the Qing were concerned, were the Christian missionaries who roamed hither and thither across the countryside, banning foot binding, teaching English, and proclaiming the Gospels, which had a few, shall we say, unforeseen consequences. In 1843, a failed imperial bureaucrat named Xiuquan read one of those Christian pamphlets that were floating around and reached the perfectly sane and reasonable conclusion that he was the younger brother of Jesus. Yes, that Jesus. Furthermore, Hong decided it was his mission in life to rid China of the false Qing emperors and the devil-worshipping Confucians. Realizing their mistake, American missionaries scrambled to dissuade young Hong from his plans of violent insurrection, but to little avail. His movement rapidly gained supporters who may not have believed everything he said, but who certainly had an axe to grind against the corrupt Qing authorities. It must be remembered that the Qing were not ethnically Han Chinese, so we can throw a bit of bigotry in there as well. For the next 20 years or so, the Taiping Rebellion, as it became known, raged across China. For comparison's sake, around the same time, the United States was fighting its own civil war in which nearly 500,000 young men lost their lives. In China, 20 to 30 million people lost their lives. It is often considered the bloodiest civil war in all of history, and almost no one, including myself to my great shame, knows very much about it. The Qing Dynasty never really recovered from this awful catastrophe. Many, understandably, blamed the foreigners for provoking this turmoil, and at the end of the century another rebellion broke out, the Boxer Rebellion. This time, a group calling themselves the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists decided to rid China of all foreign influence through the use of Kung Fu. Among other things, these guys believed their magical inner life force, or Qi, would enable them to bounce artillery shells off their stomachs, catch bullets in their teeth, and defeat a professionally trained modern army with their fruity little punches and kicks. As you might imagine, this did not end particularly well. The Qing court vacillated on whether or not to support the Boxers, but once they began murdering the diplomats of that most humane and tolerant people, the Germans, the jig was up.
Time's over, boy.
An 8-nation alliance, including the United States and Japan, teamed up to wax the floor with these delusional Chinamen.
Men from China.
In yet another humiliating contretemps. Now, the Qing court did attempt to negotiate its way out of the situation, yet throughout all its dealings with the West, it was hampered by a political tradition that had long ago calcified and grown brittle. The Qing Dynasty were attempting to hold together a sprawling empire under tremendous internal and external pressure, with a state apparatus relatively unchanged since the days of the Tang Dynasty. Frankly, it's astonishing they clung on to power for as long as they did.
Where are your ancestors buried?
In Scotland, Your Majesty.
But then, where's your skirt?
very last Chinese emperor. And that's it, that's all you need to know. A far more interesting person, however, is his grandmother, Empress Dowager Cixi. For well over 40 years, this tiny, shrewd, clawed woman had been calling all the shots in China. When her useless and pathetic son complained that he, as emperor, ought to be running the show, Cixi had him locked up in his room with his concubines. Not unlike that dream I had when I was a little boy.
Thank you, God!
Cixi attempted to chart a middle course between reform and tradition. She bade her ministers to embark on all these comedic attempts to modernize. First, they created a new army modeled on Western lines that they called the New Army. But then some bureaucrat misplaced it, so they had to create a whole new army, this one called the Beiyang Army. Of course, they created a Beiyang fleet to go along with it, and also a Nanyang fleet, and a Guangdong fleet, and a Fujian fleet, all of which were almost totally annihilated by the French. Well, I'll be damned. The French actually won a naval engagement. Good for you.
Tu viens nous parler comme de la merde? Bah oui. Mais t'es qui pour me parler comme ça, toi? Putain, t'es qui pour me parler comme ça, toi?
By the way, Bei in Chinese simply means north. So Beijing, although I'm going to keep calling it Peking for personal reasons, simply means North City. There's a lot of places in China named that way. The province of Hebei means north of the river. The province of Hubei means north of the lake. The province of Hunan means south of the lake. And the province of Fuyu means exactly what you think it means. These are historical.
Shut the up.
Just about everybody was picking on China in those days. The nation of Japan, formerly China's scrawny kid brother, had hit the gym hard and turned into one of those roid-rage psychopaths. The Japanese took over from the French and pummeled China mercilessly in the First Sino-Japanese War. Something had to give way. And in 1911, that thing was the Wuchang Uprising. It was really one of several uprisings that had broken out across China in the wake of the failed Boxer Rebellion. However, it was undoubtedly the most successful. After a railway dispute provoked the regional garrison to march on the city of Wuchang, revolutionaries seized control of the city and declared the surrounding province to be a republic. Further revolts spread like wildfire in nearly every province and major city of China. The revolutionaries themselves were something of a motley crew. Oh, for Christ's sake, knock it off. That's not even funny. Some, like the Taiping rebels before them, dreamed of driving out the hated Manchus and founding a new dynasty pronouncedly Han in ethnicity. Others, like the Boxers, were mostly concerned with eliminating the nefarious influence of the dastardly barbarians who had come from across the sea. And still there were more others, a loose collection of oddballs, patriots, dreamers, and visionaries who had imbibed the lessons of the West and wished to apply these legal and political theories to their homeland. As a rule, they were young, dashing, well-traveled, open-minded enough to appreciate the advantages of Western-style governance, yet fired by that genuine ardor for the country that distinguishes an honest statesman. And it is really their story, their early cooperation and then their tragic disunion, that this lecture is all about. And of these revolutionaries, there would be one man, above all, who would rise to be called the father of his nation. And this man's name was...
Forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown.